Hello everyone, welcome back to Historical Geology 1404. Today we begin Module 2. We're talking about the history of life on Earth. More accurately, how life has developed and changed over history on Earth. Okay, so Module 1 was just a recap, more or less, of everything you learned in 1403. The vital things that you needed to know before we could dive into more complex subjects like how life started, perhaps, right? Some theories there. How life changes over time, and what those changes over time add up to, and how we can find evidence for those changes in geological sciences, okay, utilizing geological sciences. Before we begin, are there any questions? Everyone's taken exam 1 by now, I should hope, right? Good. I will be grading those today whenever I come back to my office. Any questions about the subject matter that was on exam 1? Yeah.
I had 2 questions that I couldn't see the picture.
Right. That was something that I mentioned. Were you using an ECISD laptop? Is that your own laptop? How interesting. It's the first time someone using their own laptop has had a problem with it. Because a lot of the time the school district filters will block out some of the pictures. So I encourage people to use their own laptops. Could you send me an email later and then tell me which questions that was? Because Blackboard is constantly updating their services. It's conceivable that they may have done an update that made one or more of my files broken. And I would need to know that if that's the case. So would you mind letting me know? I really appreciate that. Okay, but I'm sorry that happened. I'll definitely take that into account while I'm grading. Did you leave me a note on there saying couldn't see these pictures? No. Okay, that's fine. Then when you send me that email, give me the details, and I'll look at that. Okay. Okay. What else? Okay. I don't think I've got any other announcements to make other than your next exam will be in 2 weeks. There are 4 lectures in Module 2, and then you'll have your exam 2. And then we will begin, the last couple of weeks, we'll be going over Module 3. Okay, well, let's begin. Today is Lecture 5, The Diversity of Life. Now, I've shown you. Actually, maybe I haven't. I don't think I have. This is what's called a tree of life. This might be the first one you're ever seeing. Is this the first time any of you have seen a tree of life? Yeah? Yeah. Oh, it is your first time? Okay. Now, you can kind of see why it's called a tree if you kind of tilt it up. I have it sideways so that you can actually see more of it. If I tilted it up, I'd have to make it smaller, right? Because it would be in portrait. But you can see why we refer to this sort of shape as a tree. It almost has sort of like the trunk and branches sort of look to it, with, you know, smaller branches with leaves and everything in there. Now, there are a few things to be aware of when you're looking at a tree of life. First off, it can be subject to a few things called bias. Is that still going on?
Yep.
How long does this last? They got you out?
I couldn't find my goggles and they were in my backpack. It was like right in the parking lot of that shit.
Shoot. Why is this still going on?
Because until everyone's gone.
Until everyone's gone? Jeez, process of elimination?
Yeah.
Bro, that is so waited.
Shoot.
Part of the game, but
Did you get him? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right, so back to the tree of life. Something that affects the way that we look at the progress of life through time is bias. And you can see that bias on this tree of life. Now, if you imagine that this tree is flipped up, so the trunk is on the bottom and the top leaves are on top, what is on top? What is at the pinnacle, the peak of this tree of life?
and
What kind of animal specifically? we've got mammals, monotremes, marsupials, placentals. We fall into the placental category, right? Represented here by a tiger, interestingly enough. They can represent it with a tiger however much they want, but this is still an example of human bias because it puts us at the top, right? We are obviously the pinnacle of nature, of evolution, of life through time, right? Nah, that's kind of a skewed mentality, right? We can make that assessment because we're the ones making it. So this tree of life and many others are kind of subject to that bias. There are other ways you can construct trees of life that don't actually end up with placental mammals at the very top of it, but many of them do show that because of that innate human bias that we have. Regardless, this tree is still generally, accurate. It's still right in the way that it connects all of these different organisms, right? The bacteria, the first forms of life, often the most basic, I don't want to say primitive. It's not primitive, but it's single cells, right? Where it all began. And then moving on through time to all of these crazy different diversity of organisms that we have had through time and that we have still today, many of these different groups. Okay. How did life begin?
Big Bang.
The life didn't begin with the Big Bang, though. The Big Bang spat hydrogen out into an empty universe. That hydrogen coalesced together and formed clouds. Those clouds went supercritical, became stars, I should say. Those stars generated heavier elements through the R process. That R process, making all those heavy elements, ultimately caused those stars to either explode or go dark, go become just essentially they burn out. But many of them explode, and when they explode, they shove all of those heavier elements out into the universe. Those heavier elements come together and form clouds. Some of those clouds make new stars. Some of those clouds of debris form new planets around those stars, and then we end up with star systems like our own. But what happens after that? What happened here? How did life begin? Thoughts? Alan?
Sun was there to create the life, like with the sun and its rays, and then the planets formed, like Earth, which like over time Earth was like continents, water, and then I think around like before Pangea, that's when the first signs of dinosaurs started to come up.
Long before Pangea were dinosaurs, yeah.
Just bacteria that started.
Bacteria, huh? Cells became more complex. There was bacteria. Yeah, but what's before bacteria? Any thoughts? Yeah.
I thought the most common theory was a comet that was carried, I believe, bacteria, some single cell organisms.
Right, so we can all pretty much agree that bacteria are the earliest forms of life that we've got in the fossil record. But bacteria can't just spring up out of nowhere, right? It's still a living thing, and something must have come before that. Now, there are a couple of different theories for how life began. The first one I'm going to talk about is the terrigenous theory. That is, it started here in what we refer to as the primordial soup. You ever heard that term? Sounds delicious, doesn't it? 4 billion years ago, our oceans are developing, right? Still pretty shallow. Earth is still very warm, and our atmosphere is nothing like it is today. Okay? Mostly methane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, ammonia, like melt your lungs kind of stuff. Okay? You wouldn't want to take a deep breath out on Earth 4 billion years ago. Okay? But this set the stage for some very interesting chemical reactions. If you combine certain of those naturally occurring inorganic molecules, like ammonia and methane and nitrogen and carbon dioxide, and you put them in the right situation, it turns out those things can make organic molecules. You can form organic molecules, and by the way, that includes amino acids from these things. We've done this in tests. There was a series of tests conducted in the 50s, fascinating tests, where you basically take all of these gases and molecules that we know were there on Earth as our oceans were forming. You put them in a sealed vessel, you put a little bit of heat in there, and you provide an electric charge, and all of a sudden, there's organic molecules everywhere. Your vessel is filled with amino acids. What are amino acids? Amino acids are the building blocks of DNA. Amino acids go on to make those proteins. Okay? So we go from amino acids to proteins as these amino acids bond together. Some of these amino acids start to form chains. Chains of amino acids all of a sudden represent forms of information. Different amino acids are drawn to other different amino acids based upon the nature, the chemical nature of the chain that they are a part of. And now amino acids and these chains of amino acids can go and, proteins basically, can go and link, basically absorb other things, other proteins, other chains, until we start building up more complex, longer strings of what become code. Okay? Think of these as RNA. But then there was a change. All of a sudden, for one reason or another, and we're still trying to figure that out, RNA, single chains of information stored in amino acids, made a second chain. They were able to bond in a second chain, making a double helix shape, and that makes the first DNA. And it is that DNA which is capable of storing information that set the building block for the development of the first cells. These cells were essentially just sugar, basic sugars that were bonded together to make a protective casing around these early protein DNAs. And then, as time goes on, more and more mass is added to these cells. And you get different parts of these cells that are meant for different functions. How are they able to keep the information to perform those functions? That's what the DNA does, right? DNA stores information. Your DNA, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of codes of DNA in each of our bodies, okay? And they control what we look like, how healthy we are. Do I need glasses? Are my eyes blue? Do my fingernails grow quickly? All of these things about us are controlled within our DNA, using information stored over billions of years of time. These early forms of DNA probably didn't have a whole lot going on. They weren't all that complicated. But as time goes on, they add more amino acid chains and they start to get a little bit more complicated. They're starting to get more in depth. There is a new diversity that starts to show up. The longer the DNA chains are, the more variables you are adding that make them different from other DNA chains. And so we start to see different varieties of these cells. Some end up being more successful than others. Some die off pretty quick. Maybe there's a slight temperature change. And certain DNA types within these cells are more conducive to surviving in the cold, right? And so we start to see the development of hardier, stronger bacteria, or not bacteria at this point, but cellular genomes, okay? Now, eventually, bacteria does show up through this process. Bacteria are these cells that work together, work in tandem to survive as a better whole. Like the bacteria in your sponge, right? You know when your sponge gets that really nasty gray look and it stinks to high heaven? You got to boil it to return it to something of semblance of usability, right? That's a bacteria colony that has spread through your sponge, okay? We use bacteria everywhere, by the way. Cheese made through the process of bacteria. Most dairy products utilize bacteria to some extent. Okay? Your gut is filled with tiny little organisms, some of which are bacteria, the rest of which I'll talk about in a little bit. Okay? But it helps you break down your food. Now, eventually, this bacteria goes on to become other different types of cells that work together to make different purposes, and ultimately ends up with the world we see today, where both you and a tree are the descendants of these first forms of cellular life. This is the Terrigenous theory, that here on Earth, where this primordial soup it was an ideal stage for life to develop through this process. Now, there are two different types of metabolism that have resulted here on Earth. Okay? There's your chemosynthesis and your photosynthesis. Chemosynthesis is basically being able to break down chains of molecules from some substance to give yourself energy, you as an individual organism. Okay? Usually through some form of oxidation process. Photosynthesis is being able to absorb light from our star and use that to add to your mass. Okay, so you take in molecules like how trees are photosynthetic. That's not a surprise to anyone, right? Trees will take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then utilizing the energy from sunlight, they will crack the carbon and the oxygen in the carbon dioxide apart and use the carbon and oxygen and water to build their mass. Trees grow over time through this process by adding carbon to their different chains in their structures. They use more of the carbon than they do the oxygen, and so they release O2, right? Oxygen gas. You and I, what are we? Are we chemosynthetic or photosynthetic? We're more or less chemosynthetic, right? There is a range of chemosynthetic organisms. We are on that scale. We don't require sunlight, right? At least not for our digestive processes or for metabolism of any kind. We require it for other health reasons. If you put someone out of the sunlight for their entire life, they will die unhealthily, but not because of metabolism reasons. Okay? We require the sun for other health reasons. But we are more or less chemosynthetic. There are other organisms on Earth that are chemosynthetic, though. There are lots of bacteria that are chemosynthetic. Matter of fact, most bacteria don't necessarily need the sun. Okay? There are organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean, at those mid-ocean ridges, miles underwater, black, dark water. Absolutely no need for sunlight whatsoever. They are chemosynthetic organisms. Our star could go out right now. Our Earth would freeze over, and those things wouldn't even know the difference because they live at the bottom of the ocean and they get the required energy from the vents that spit boiling water out from the bottom of the ocean. Okay? You remember where we've got those divergent plate boundaries and the fault systems, and the water makes its way down there, and then it gets really hot and it brings up all the dissolved metals and makes those black smokers at the bottom of the ocean. You remember we talked about that? These colonies of chemosynthetic organisms live down there. They wouldn't know if our star went out. It has never mattered to them. So this raises a very fascinating question. If chemosynthetic organisms that do not need sunlight could exist here on Earth, doesn't that mean they could exist anywhere else too? We've talked a little bit about other places just in our solar system that could represent a place that life could exist. Do you remember any of those places that we've mentioned?
One of the moons is Saturn.
Yes, Titan. Mars possibly, but not for this reason. There were three. Titan was one of them. Enceladus and Europa. Titan, Enceladus, and Europa, all three of those places have liquid water underneath miles of ice crust. Liquid water down there. kept liquid by the heat of a warm core of that moon. Now, there are lots of theories as to what's keeping those moon cores warm. Most people agree it's probably because of the warping motion of that core as it's being pulled by the sun, but also simultaneously by the mass of Jupiter or Saturn, depending on which planet they're orbiting. But this warping that happens because of the gravity pull from both objects, okay? And they believe that that provides just enough energy to keep the core warm and therefore keep a layer of liquid water between the core and the outer ice crust that separates it from space. There is no atmosphere. Or there is an atmosphere on Titan and Europa. It's very thin and usually filled with things like ammonia and methane. But they all have an ice crust with liquid water under them. If chemosynthetic life can develop here on Earth, who's to say that it cannot develop in those places too? They never need sunlight. Let's deepen the plot a little bit more. We actually sent a satellite past Enceladus not long ago. And that satellite picked up molecules of ice that have been thrown off the surface of Enceladus. Enceladus has a very unique and interesting geological phenomena. It has more or less what you would call ice tectonics, where here on Earth, our tectonic plates are made out of rock, and when they interact with each other, mountains and volcanoes develop. And those volcanoes, throw out molten rock. On Enceladus, there appears to be a variety of tectonics with the ice plates that are on the surface there. And there are, as a result, ice volcanoes because the process is so similar. And those ice volcanoes, if rock volcanoes throw out lava, ice volcanoes would throw out what? Water. And they erupt liquid water out of these ice volcanoes periodically. And because Enceladus is a very small body, a lot of that water kind of hangs out in space over the surface for a while before it eventually is drawn back down to the surface by gravity. But one of our satellites picked up a sample of that ice doing a flyby, and it found organic molecules in that ice. So we know that there are organic molecules being generated on Enceladus, which means the likelihood of it happening on Titan and Europa, highly likely as well. So this causes us to start to really consider something else. If there is the potential for life to develop on other places because of the likelihood that it could have developed here on Earth, then who's to say that it developed here on Earth in the first place at all? This takes us to our second theory about where life began. Terrigenous means it began on Earth. Panspermia. Now, this is the theory that suggests it could have come from somewhere else. We have bacteria that can survive extremely hot conditions and extremely cold conditions. We call these extremophile bacteria. They are those ones that live at the bottom of the ocean. They are the ones that live in the boiling hot water in Yellowstone. They are the ones that we find living on the bottom of ice floes in Antarctica. Okay? There are organisms that are so difficult to kill, I guess you could say, that they will survive in space. Funny story. There was a satellite that was sent to the moon. I want to say this was a couple of decades back now. Probably less than that, actually. Maybe a decade and a half. But part of this was a university put together what is more or less a time capsule. Do you know what a time capsule is? So, you put like music from your modern day, maybe a book, some notes, right? And part of this time capsule was a petri dish that contained little water bears. Do you know what those are? Why can't I remember their scientific name? It starts with a T, I think. But they're little microscopic life forms, okay, that are extremely difficult to kill. They can survive in space. But this time capsule crashed on its way to the moon and spilled out its payload everywhere. So now technically there is life on the moon because these tiny little microscopic organisms are up there. They're probably in a state of desiccation. You put a little water on them, they'll come back to life. But technically, they are still alive, and they are up there. So the moon has a population, I guess you could say. Regardless, where was I going with that? Oh, right. Okay, we were talking about the potential for life to exist other places. If we have extremophile bacteria here on Earth that developed in chemosynthetic metabolism, okay, then that could be true on those other moons, Europa, Titan, and Enceladus. Could be true for many other planets everywhere else as well. Now, if that's the case, what if an asteroid hits that planet, breaks some pieces of that planet off, those pieces fly through space, those pieces land on other worlds, and seed essentially that life on that world? This is what panspermia comes down to. Life began somewhere else and then came here. It's possible it could have come from Mars. Mars and Earth developed around about the same time. Mars has always been a little colder than Earth. The Earth has always been a little warmer. Like, it took longer to cool off is what I mean. What if life started on Mars? We know, all you have to do is look at the surface of Mars and see how many asteroid impacts it gets, right? What if life started on Mars because it cooled off faster than Earth did? Earth was still a boiling hot mess by the time the temperatures on Mars were cool enough for some form of life to exist, perhaps. And then an asteroid strikes Mars, breaks chunks of it off, and then those chunks land here. There are pieces of Mars here on Earth. We know that. There are pieces of Earth on Mars. We know that too. There have been devastating impacts on both planets. When enough debris is thrown into space, some of that debris ultimately gets caught in the gravity well and orbit of the other planet. So what if one of those pieces of debris from Mars came here with some extremophile bacteria on it? And that, in fact, is how life began here. Are we refugee Martians? If there was life on Mars, and we find an answer to that, could it have been taken there by a piece of debris from Earth? And it just didn't survive there because the environment was too hostile, too different from Earth. These are all great questions. But this is what panspermia comes down to. Now, you can put a little more of a sci-fi twist on it. You can say the many, many theories that life began because aliens put the seeds for life on Earth. That also is a form of panspermia. Have you all ever seen the Alien franchise? The Alien movies? No? It's kind of what it comes down to, that there's this race of aliens that just goes throughout the galaxy, seeding life on other planets and genetically making it whatever they want it to be, right? And that's how life on Earth began. That's implied that that's how life on Earth began, right? That is a form of panspermia that fits under this category, intentional or otherwise, that life began somewhere else and came here. All right, yeah, we talked about that. Okay, well, this takes us to another different conversation. What exactly is life? We talked about how it could have begun, but what is it? What is the criteria for something to be alive?
I forgot.
Okay, while Anthony's thinking about that, Abby, when I say alive, what do you think? Give me one word that represents living things. What does alive mean to you? No? Claudia, you want to help out? One word. When I say life.
I don't know, like the brain.
A brain? Okay, that's a word. Thank you. A brain. Do all living things have a brain? Not necessarily. A brain is a development mostly in, animals and such. Trees don't have brains, but thank you for participating. I appreciate that, actually. Okay, another word.
Reproduce.
Huh?
Reproduce.
Reproduce. Life reproduces. Is this true? Do all living things reproduce? Do you say no? I was going to say, is this a sad commentary on like I'm always going to be single, or like yes, living things reproduce. Okay? There isn't a single living thing on this planet that does not in some way reproduce. It's not always in the same way. There are many, many different ways. My master's thesis, sorry for calling you out there. My master's thesis was about a group of organisms called ostracods that reproduce sexually part of the time, but parthenogenically the rest of the time. Now what that means is an ostracod is neither male or female during parthenogenesis. It simply creates eggs within its body that are more or less copies of itself. And then it releases those eggs, and those eggs grow. Now, when the environment changes, or when the population is under genetic stress, because if you have the same gene pool for long enough, then it starts to break down, right? We'll talk more about that later. Then all of a sudden, they go from a parthenogenic population that just make copies of themselves, and some of the population become male and some of the population become female. And then they reproduce sexually so that they can get more variety in their gene pool and survive better as a population through whatever struggle there is at the time. Okay? So there is not only one way to reproduce, but that is an essential aspect. What else? One more thing. Doesn't even have to be the right one. Let's hear one more thing about what life is. Yeah? Water? Does all life need water? Not technically. Sure does make it helpful, though. What was the other one I heard over here? Active? What do you mean by active?
Something is always happening.
Something's always happening.
Whether it be like minuscule or...
I think that's the nature of dynamic Earth, right? What, do you mean like metabolism is always happening, or because there are those organisms I talked about earlier, right? Where they basically go into a state of desiccation, even if they're just in space. Nothing is happening in their body, but you add a little bit of water and they come back to life all of a sudden. Then something's happening. But the fact that they can come back means that they're still, to some extent, alive. So that's kind of a tricky one. Okay, the two criteria that most people agree on for being alive. Self-replication, that's that reproduction, right? And self-regulation. Now that's more like metabolism. Everything has a metabolism because everything needs to consume nutrients of one kind or another. You can eat a hamburger. Trees can eat carbon dioxide and water. Bacteria, well, to be fair, they can eat your hamburger too, right? They can eat pretty much whatever. But all things have some form of a metabolism because it is a fact of life that you have to continually take in material to grow and replicate and reproduce and do all of these things and sustain yourself. That is part of life. Okay? So a cell is just a membrane binding a whole bunch of different organelles, okay, each of which has a genetic code and can split apart and make copies of themselves. And those copies do various functions. Your DNA controls how many cells of each kind your body maintains. It controls where they are. Each of your cells has its own DNA that determines, hey, you do this. Hey, you do that. Turn on now, turn off then. Now, cells grow and repopulate and produce and all of these things. So yeah, you are essentially made out of trillions of living things, each of which is working towards one function, keeping this one living thing functional. okay, and alive. So here's an interesting question. Are viruses alive?
I think so.
Anthony looked like he was going to come out of the gate strong with a comment. He was like halfway out of his chair. He looked like he was going to go, yes or no. What did you say?
I think so.
You think so? All right, we have two different sides of the debate here. Give me one reason why viruses could be alive.
Because they know it's a strike in your body or something.
That you think that they have a purpose, like they know what they're doing?
Yeah.
Okay. Anthony, why no?
If I remember correctly, they were lacking something that required them to be alive, but I don't exactly remember.
Lacking something required to be alive. What did we just discuss is needed for something to be alive? The two criteria we're discussing.
They can't self-replicate.
They can't self-replicate. Or can they? Let's talk about what viruses do. A virus is a single code of amino acids, an RNA chain. No DNA in a virus, only that one chain. No double helix, just the single. Okay? Which means that it cannot store data. It's more or less a messenger device. Our bodies have RNA. You can think of tame viruses. They have a single purpose to send messages. Our body is sending 1 trillion RNA messages every second. Okay? It's telling my cells to do certain things, telling my brain to send certain signals. Whatever it is, think of them as the mail service for life, for cellular life. A virus is essentially an RNA that has only one purpose: replicate. Okay? So what does a virus do? It has that single one message, replicate. It will go into one of your cells. It will burrow through your cell wall. And all of a sudden, it's going to start copying itself using the ingredients found there. It would be like if I went into Ray's house and I took all of Ray's food and I made all of the meals I wanted, but only one meal, right? If you had all of these ingredients for delicious food and I could make 1,000 different meals with it and I only made grilled cheese sandwiches, I turned all of your food into grilled cheese sandwiches. Oh, and then I turned all of your furniture into grilled cheese sandwiches too. And then I turned your house into a grilled cheese sandwich. Right? That sounds pretty good right now. It's like that. Maybe a silly example, but you get what I'm saying. They only have one message: make more of me. And so it goes into that cell, and it turns all of the things into that cell, it rips them apart and recombines them together into copies of itself. And so one viral messenger goes into your cell and 1,000 come out. And that's why viral infections are so difficult to get rid of. Okay? Because they propagate that quickly, and because they aren't something, white blood cells can't really do anything about it. White blood cells are essentially cells that are specifically designed to destroy things that are hurting your body. Okay? Bacteria, a bacterial cell, white blood cell surrounds it, basically dissolves it. You can't dissolve an RNA virus, which is one strike against them being alive. If they were, white blood cells could do anything about it. Instead, the only thing white blood cells can do is essentially smother it. This is why you get exhausted when you're fighting a viral infection. Your body is working overtime to generate 1 billion times more white blood cells than it normally should need to, just because each one of those viral cells needs to get smothered by white blood cells. And then it comes out through your sweat, it comes out through your pee, it comes out through your poop, right? You vomit up it sometimes, depending on the type of viral infection. But your body has to get rid of all of these viruses, and the only way to do it is to smother them in white blood cells and then expel those white blood cells out through some mechanism, okay? And that's why it takes a while to get over a viral infection, like the flu. So, as a matter of fact, it turns out viruses do replicate. But here's the deal. There is no variation. There is only one possible outcome to the self-replication. The exact same RNA code of the original viral strain. There are mutations that occur to viral strains over time, but that's a product not of DNA change. That's more, or of RNA change. That's more of a product of picking things up from their hosts over time. But that's something we can discuss later. Okay? So, based on that context, are they alive? Not so much. Can they self-replicate? Not so much. They basically, you can think of it as they're churning out factory exact copies of themselves. What about self-regulation? They can't do that either. They don't have any of the functions necessary to do that. Where do they get their energy? From the cells that they rip apart. They only need energy for one thing, that self-replication, and they rip apart other cells to do it. There is no real metabolism here. So, what's the consensus? No. As a matter of fact, viruses are not alive. Keep going here. Okay. They are not bound by any kind of membrane. They do not metabolize. And they do not replicate so much as make picture-perfect copies of themselves. I like to think of viruses as the androids or robots of the natural world, where they appear to be doing things that living things do, but they are not actually doing those things. Of course, in our modern day and age, where AI is becoming so complex, so advanced, we might need to start rethinking exactly what living means. Do you guys ever watch Megan?
Yeah.
Do you see the trailer for Megan 2?
Yes.
It looks interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that movie. It's leaning into more of the tropes than the first one did. The first one was like, wow, okay, that was a good movie that kind of came out of left field. This one feels more like
Spy Kid.
Megan, Terminator 2, you know? But have you ever seen the Terminator movies? In the first movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger is the villain, and in the second one, he comes back and he's helping them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like Terminator 2, which will probably make it a good movie to watch. But I don't expect it to be as fun as original, I guess, as the first one. But that's what I'm talking about, right? Where AI all of a sudden, what if a law gets passed that considers AI to be alive? Can AI have opinions? Can AI have feelings? I don't know how far we are from that. There are definitely AIs that can make their own choices now. Does the ability to make your own choice and follow a decision through, does that make you alive? What if you don't have a body for metabolizing? What if metabolizing information is the way that you metabolize? What exactly do all of these definitions mean now? I don't know. Hopefully we can figure that out, though. Okay. Fossilization. Fossilization is the process by which life is preserved in rock. What happens here? Every cell in a living thing is replaced by a mineral crystal. Some kind of structure has to replace them. Now, the better that process of replacement is, the smaller your crystals are, for example, the better quality your fossil can be. You can save the general shapes, or you can get things as complex as the texture and skin fossilized. It really depends on the sediment that it's preserved in, how long it took, what the conditions were when it died, what the conditions were when it was buried, all these things. For the most part, though, only hard parts get preserved. Horns, teeth, bones, things like that. Why would only hard parts get preserved most of the time?
They're more dense.
More dense? Why don't the soft parts survive? Pressurization is part of the fossilization process, sure. But that's not the only thing at play here. Oxygen, yeah. Doing what?
Breaking down cellular.
Right. Well, okay, let me ask you this. You order a T-bone steak. You eat everything, even the bone, right? No? Why don't you eat the bone?
It's too hard.
Yeah, you can't eat it. Really? If you tried, you'd break your teeth, or definitely wouldn't be a pleasant experience to swallow, right? Okay, so when something dies, the soft parts are often taken away through some process. Something's going to eat the soft parts, or they are going to decay through oxidization, right? Exposure to oxygen increases the rate at which things decay. So they degrade or they are removed fairly quickly most of the time. There are a few rare exceptions to that. If something is buried very quickly, for example, then the soft parts can be fossilized. There are a couple of ways fossilization can happen. Mineral replacement, where each of those cells is replaced by a mineral like quartz or maybe calcite. Or carbonization is a very interesting one. Carbonization is when there's a lot of carbon in whatever the sediment is that is formed around your life form, okay? Whatever died and got buried, okay? And that carbon is used instead to replace all of those cells. I have seen this happen once. I was in Montana on a dig, and I uncovered entire tree trunks made entirely out of carbon. Beautiful texture, totally well preserved, but as soon as we dug them up and exposed them to the atmosphere, they started to fall apart. They started to crack. They dried out. And before an entire day had passed, my whole tree trunk had turned into a pile of black ash, more or less, just straight up black carbon. They do not survive well after you expose them to the atmosphere. But that is one way that you can get replacement. Now, exceptions to the hard part rule, we call these Lagerstätten. There's a fun word. Everyone say it with me. Lagerstätten. Lagerstätten. You want to say it with me? No? Lagerstätten? No? You don't want to learn German today? Okay. Lagerstätten are what we call when you get very soft-bodied organisms or soft tissues like skin that are preserved so well that you can get great scientific data from them. So something like this worm. Worms, any hard parts? No, and yet here it is. Lagerstätten. Dinosaur skin, no hard parts. We find it sometimes. Lagerstätten. Hair, fur, feathers, Lagerstätten. Okay? Now what about plants? What hard parts do plants have? When was the last time you saw a plant with a horn or teeth? There's a terrifying image. Are those hard or are those soft tissues? They're the hardest part, but still not a dense mineral structure like a bone or a tooth, right? So how do we have fossil plants then? Huh? Imprints, definitely. You can have imprints for plants and animals. That's definitely one way. You ever heard of cellulose? Not cellulite, right? It's not the unfortunate body fat that we all develop over time. No, cellulose. This is a structure that plants grow. It makes a hexagonal framework within the tissues of our plants. Now, the other plant cells reside between the hexagonal framework of cellulose. It is this hexagonal framework of rigid cellulose that allows plants to grow upright, that allows them to hold themselves up, okay, to fight gravity, to be rigid in the face of wind. When that cellulose structure fails, that's when your plant breaks, right? Falls over. Now, while the soft, easily oxidized cells between the cellulose leaves pretty quickly, rots away, the cellulose itself will often remain. which means that we get minerals that grow between those hexagonal pockets of cellulose. So plants actually offer very interesting opportunities for isotope analysis because you'll often have a lot of the original mass, cellulose mass in a plant fossil that was there when the plant was alive. And you can do a variety of tests on the ingredients of that cellulose. Okay? Then we've got things like molds, right? We talked about molds just now. You said imprints. Molds, impressions, trace fossils. These are not the actual pieces of the living thing, but they are evidence of the pieces that were there before. Oftentimes what will happen is something like a seashell will be trapped in mud, and then that seashell will break down, or it'll dissolve away or rot away, leaving behind only a negative space in the shape of that shell. And that negative space may actually get filled in by mud later on and make a cast. Okay? Or we may fill that negative impression in, that mold in, and make a cast ourselves out of it. And then trace fossils, obviously evidence of the life without being part of the life itself, like a footprint. Any questions so far? No? So now that we've talked about potential origins of life and what life is and ways that we can find evidence for it, let's talk a little bit about how life changes. Sebastian, you're wearing a sweater. If I turned up the temperature in here 10 degrees, what would you do? You take it off. Congratulations. You can change. If I dropped the temperature in here 40 degrees, what would you do? You'd put your jacket on. You can change too. Life changes all the time. It's just that we don't choose it most of the time. There are very few exceptions to where some things can choose how they change, right? You and me, we have this thing, free will. We can make our own choices. I could drop the temperature in here 40 degrees and you would still not maybe put on your sweater. I don't want to. I just don't want to, right? I don't feel like it. I'm not going to give in, right? You can make that choice. A dog, on the other hand, if I dropped the temperature 40 degrees, would leave and find somewhere warmer, right? That's just something that they would do. The dog would not make the choice, I don't want to. And then bacteria wouldn't be able to leave or do anything whatsoever, right? There are different degrees to which life can choose to change. But there are changes that happen at the cellular and subcellular DNA level that happen whether we choose them or not. Okay? All forms of life on Earth have DNA. This is a DNA strand, that classic double helix shape, right? With chains of amino acids in different configurations, and each configuration stores data in a different way. Think of this as lines of code, but far more complicated than zeros and ones, right? When our DNA changes, it is often the result of a mutation. Have you heard the word mutation before? What is mutation?
A change in genetics.
A change in genetics, sure. Yeah, in this context, absolutely. Mutation is often a word that is used to describe a drastic change to something that exists already. Okay? You guys any X-Men fans in here? Okay. What do you call the X-Men? They are mutants. Right. Because in the story, they have experienced some sort of change. Although I do say there's a difference. A mutant is someone who is the result of a genetic change that deviates them from their species as a result of something that happened before they were born. Maybe if Wolverine's daddy had gotten a mutation, and then that mutation caused Wolverine to be born with his mutation, right? He could be a mutant. But if you fall into a vault of acid or a vat of acid, or you get hit by an X-ray burst or whatever that changes your DNA, you're not a mutant. You are technically a mutate. But I guess Stan Lee never bothered looking into the variety or the different definitions there. A mutation happens to your DNA constantly. Mutations are most commonly caused by radiation. Radiation. You got protons and neutrons and electrons zipping around in space all around us all the time. What's the most common source of radiation in our lives? The sun. Thank you. Most of that radiation is blocked by Earth's magnetic field, and then a bunch of it more is blocked by the atmosphere, but... Oh, interesting. All right. But enough of it makes it through that it still impacts your sun. What do we do with that most of the time? We go lie out on the beach and get a nice tan, right? Interesting to think, isn't it, that a single particle of radiation, a single photon from our star traveled hundreds of millions of miles through space, made it through our electromagnetic field, made it through our atmosphere, only to be absorbed by the skin on your bum as you're getting a tan. What a dramatic end, or what a weird end to a dramatic journey, right? But that radiation gets absorbed by your body. It impacts your skin. Some of it makes it past your skin. But sometimes what happens is it will interact with your DNA in a particular way. It'll knock one of those off. Or it'll hit it and give it just enough energy that amino acid changes. Perhaps it destroys itself. Perhaps it changes into a new form, a new amino acid. Perhaps this will become that amino acid. But the message that is contained, the data that is contained within your DNA structure is changed to the point where it contains new data. And that new data sends new messages. Sometimes those messages are positive and sometimes they are negative. This, my friends, is how we change. This is a mutation. And sometimes that mutation doesn't matter much, right? If you were born with 6 fingers on your right hand, would that make a big difference in your life?
No.
Would that dictate your survival?
No.
No. As a matter of fact, one of my nephews that was in our classroom last week, he has 6 fingers on his right hand. He has 2 thumbs. Okay? I didn't show y'all. He's 6 years old. I didn't want to put him on the spot. But if any of you had gone to shake his hand, you would see that he has 2 thumbs on his right hand. It does not change his lifestyle at all. He can survive just fine. That is a mutation that really doesn't change a whole much. But what if,
Do they both work?
yeah, they're joined right here.
Sometimes the finger is just there.
Like a vestigial sort of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they share a knuckle at the base. So he bends both of them when he bends that knuckle. Sometimes you get a mutation that is absolutely positive. Like if a wolf developed a mutation for longer, sharper teeth, positive or negative? Probably positive for a predator like that. What if a wolf developed a mutation for shorter, duller teeth? Positive or negative? It's a negative mutation, right? Right. So, what happens to organisms that develop negative mutations? What's going to happen to them in the natural world? Yeah, they're going to disappear. They're going to die off, unfortunately, pretty quick. But what that means is that negative mutation does not spread through the gene pool, right? If I'm a short-toothed, dull-toothed wolf and I don't get to catch my food or I don't get to eat my food, if I'm not as efficient a predator, I'm going to die off pretty quick. And so I will not make any offspring that have short teeth and duller teeth.
Survival of the fittest.
Okay, so this is where the concept of survival of the fittest comes from. Okay? Natural selection is another word for that, which, believe me, we will be talking about. Only successful traits are passed on to succeeding generations. Our ancestors, theoretically, right? We'll talk about this later on. Came from the same ones as chimpanzees. But we have larger brain cases. We'll talk about all of these different traits through human evolution over time. But as a result of a gene, a mutation that caused larger brain cases and larger brains, we now are at a different place on the totem pole of life on Earth than chimpanzees are, even though we're only related a couple million years back, right? Here are some other examples. The rock pocket mouse. In New Mexico, in the desert, there is a lava flow, a basalt lava flow. What color is the rock basalt?
Gray.
Gray, black, dark gray to black, right? The desert, typically sandy, tan colored, right? There's a species of mouse, the rock pocket mouse, where the ones that live out in the desert are tan colored. They're that sandy tan. The ones that live on the lava flow are black. They are still the same species. Why did this happen?
Camouflage helps it hide itself from predators.
Sure, camouflage helps it hide itself from predators. So one day, tens of thousands of years ago, a mouse decided, you know what? I want black fur so I can hide better. Is that what happened? No. And here's the kicker with mutations. We can't control them. They're always happening. Some are going to be positive, some are going to be negative, but we can't control them. What does determine whether they are successful or not is your environment, right? If I'm a rock pocket mouse and I'm living on a black basalt flow and I get a mutation that causes my children to be born with fur that is a few shades darker, my children are far more likely to survive than my neighbors who still has that beautiful, bright, sandy tan color, right? So this is what happened. At some point, there was a mutation that caused black fur to become a characteristic of the population that lived on the basalt flow. There may have been black rats that existed in the desert as well. But guess what? Black in the desert stands out pretty well. So all the hawks and the foxes would eat the black ones in the desert, and they'd eat the tan ones on the flow until here today we are with sandy tan rock pocket mice in the desert and black rock pocket mice on the lava flow. Okay? Mutation did that based upon, and the success of that mutation based upon the environmental parameters. Elephants. What's the number one threat to elephants today?
Poaching us.
Yeah, humans poaching them. Kenya has an entire army dedicated to fighting off poachers, to protecting the elephants. Good for them. But they still get through. They still kill elephants. They will shoot the elephant. The elephant doesn't even need to be dead. It just needs to be shot enough that it gets on the ground. And then they'll chop off the tusks, and then they'll just leave them there to finish dying. It's brutal. It's terrible. If that's the case, then what would a positive mutation be?
A mutation that helps us survive.
Yeah, a mutation that would help you survive that particular situation. And this is where natural selection can kind of get circumvented by human intervention. The elephants use their tusks and have for a long time. We'll talk about the evolution of elephants later on. But elephants have been around for a long time, and they've had tusks for a long time, and they use those tusks to do things like defend themselves, break down trees so that they can access the yummy things on that tree, dig holes in the ground. They've used them for a lot of things over time. It is a positive, natural trait to have tusks as an elephant. But here we are in a world where the biggest threat to an elephant are humans that want those tusks, and they will shoot you for them. So, decades ago, when an elephant male was born with the random mutation of having no tusks, all of a sudden, what in nature would have been a huge disadvantage is now a major positive one. And now, decades later, there is an entire herd of tuskless elephants the most successfully growing herd of elephants in the world right now are these ones that have no tusks, because that one got a mutation and survived. And by surviving was able to breed, and through breeding passed that gene on, and now this whole herd of elephants is going to have no tusks. And in the future, there may be an entire population of them over there, an entire preserve that has no tusks. A major divergence from the history of elephants, purely because of the fact that humans would shoot you if you had an elephant tusk. If you had tusks as an elephant, I should say. How interesting is that? Natural selection changed by human intervention. Excuse me. Let me give you an example that's a little bit closer to home. I got to pick up the pace here. This is an interesting thought. Now, I want to preface this by saying I'm not a monster. This is just an interesting thought. We have this increasing trend in our society, in our population, where genetic diseases and predispositions are becoming more and more common. Okay? People are born with certain conditions that give them certain disadvantages in life. Some to a greater extent than others. But what people can agree on is that somehow the rate at which these occurrences are happening in newborns is increasing. Now, our medical technology for treating those things and for making their lives more comfortable is definitely increasing as well. But the rate at which these occurrences are happening is increasing. Why? In nature, if I, for example, with my terrible eyesight, if I was born into a population of humanity that didn't have the ability to make glasses or contact lenses, I would have a tremendous disadvantage. Everything is fuzzy that far from my face, guys. I'm not kidding. Okay? I wouldn't be able to hunt. I would be a huge burden to the population that I was born into. I'd probably die off pretty quick in nature. As would everyone else that was born with some kind of disadvantage. But in humanity, we have this wonderful, beautiful thing called empathy, love. We understand and we want to help and we want to take care of people. You have a condition, you've got a thing, I want to help you, I want to take care of it, right? That's what we do for each other. It's beautiful. But it has absolutely changed the natural development of our population because of these genetic predispositions being preserved in the gene pool and being passed on to successive generations. We have affected the nature of our own evolution by keeping those traits in the gene pool. Now, there are some people that are born, or not that are born, but have developed, who, upon understanding this, have developed a very drastic idea for how they would take care of the matter. I'll give you a hint. A world war was fought over the philosophies of one such person for how to, let's say, purify the gene pool of humanity, right? I do not subscribe to that. I'm merely pointing out how interesting it is that we have changed the nature of our own evolution by keeping such individuals in the gene pool. Interesting thought, right? My children will probably need glasses. It's in my DNA. All right, let's think about that tree again. Here's another name for that tree, phylogenetic tree. Phylogenetics. This is the study of evolutionary relationships. Excuse me. And a sort of subcategory of that is called cladogenesis. That's studying lineages. Okay, we'll talk more about clades here in a minute. But I want to talk to you about how you read phylogenetic trees. Okay, so this is a system of nested hierarchies, okay, where you have one group that gives rise to other groups, that gives rise to other groups, but they all come down to the same common ancestor, okay? This group from this ancestor, that ancestor and this ancestor from this ancestor, okay? Nested hierarchies, that's what that means. Here are a couple of different ways that you can read, excuse me, that you will see phylogenetic trees. So here we have species A, okay? Both of these trees have species B, but what's the difference here? In this bottom example, species A only continues for a certain little bit, while species A up here continues onward, contemporary with species B. Species C shows up here a little bit after B, and A disappears. Why would this possibly happen? A couldn't survive, but why? A survived here along with B, but as soon as C showed up, A couldn't survive. Maybe there wasn't enough resources. Maybe B and C were better hunters. Maybe B and C were able to populate faster, and A eventually just kind of dissolved away in the fossil record. Any number of reasons why, but we know for sure A didn't continue past that point while B and C continue to succeed. Okay, this is how you look at phylogenetic trees. There are a couple of other different ways you can look at it. But a clade is essentially a group of organisms that share common traits from a common ancestor. Okay, so C and D, that's one clade. B, C, and D, that's another clade. A, B, C, and D, that's another clade. Okay, kind of expanding outward depending on which parameters you are looking for here. There's just another way of looking at it. Okay, so let's show you some examples of clades. A clade has to involve groups that come from a common ancestor. So if this is my phylogenetic tree here, I cannot draw a circle around these ones and call that a clade, even though they may share the same traits. Why? Because these two do not share the same ancestor as these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? This is their common ancestor. These two are not connected to that common ancestor, but all of them share this common ancestor. So I could call this a clade, but not this a clade because those two don't share that ancestor. Yes? Yes, of course. This, on the other hand, is absolutely a clade. Why? Because all of these circled organisms here share this ancestor. Okay. Here's some other cladogram examples. Okay, so these are all of the horses we have in the fossil record right here. Okay, I can organize them into these groups. These are different clades. That's a clade, that's a clade, that's a clade, based upon certain characteristics. This clade, Equine, by the way, these are the ones that we have on Earth right now. Okay, molars tall, cement on all teeth. Okay, those are the characteristics shared by only these species of horse. Fewer than 4 toes on front foot, many teeth shaped like molars. Okay, I've broadened the category of what I'm looking for. All of a sudden, these all share the same clade. Okay? A more basic example, all of life on Earth, or I should say all animals on Earth. Okay? If I want to have a clade of just everything with jaws, okay, that would include jawed fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. What about if I want to include just things with lungs? Well, that means amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Claws or nails, reptiles, birds, mammals. Fur and mammary glands, that's obviously only going to be mammals. Based upon the characteristics I'm interested in studying, I can generate a clade and study those organisms that way. Okay? It's really only determined by what I'm interested in looking at as far as these traits through the fossil record. Okay, let's talk about a few misunderstandings and misconceptions that people have about this process, about evolution. People tend to look at evolution as the great chain of being. That we start off with very, very simple, basic life, and it's been progressing through time towards complex life. On first glance, that is what it seems to be. But that's only because you start from single-celled organisms, and then all the single-celled organisms start working together. Here's the deal. We still have those single-celled organisms. They are in us, right? We have bacteria in us. There's bacteria all around our planet, like in your sponge I mentioned earlier. If this great chain of being thought process were true, we wouldn't have any bacteria left. We would be going simple to complex, and all life on Earth would be following that pattern. But here we are, and we still have all of these different examples, okay, of, quote, simple life. So this can't be true. It only appears to be that at first glance. When you look at MRCAs, that's the most recent common ancestor, okay, going through that clade down your phylogenetic tree, okay, you can start to see how these traits have developed through time, kind of giving the illusion of increasing complexity. And then there's ladderizing. That is looking at something like this and saying, okay, well then A is older than B, is older than C, is older than D. That's not how it works, okay? While time is continuing to move forward, we can only display the changes in the development of these organisms through time in certain ways, okay? So A and B and C and D can all live at the same time. All we're saying here is that C and D share an ancestor with B. That's all this is saying. That's not to say these came after those. It's very possible that they did, but that's not exclusively what that means. And then there's the fact that you have species-rich and species-poor clades. Well, what if I have one clade, one group of organisms that has two species, and another group of organisms that live in the same area, that have 20 species? Naturally, I would think, well, these two species were less successful than those 20. But you got to remember, fossilization is not perfect, okay? Fossilization, there are holes, okay? There are holes. You may have just lost, who knows how many different species of organisms have lived that never got fossilized, right? Who knows how many did get fossilized and were destroyed through metamorphic processes or through different diagenetic processes. We can only piece the history of Earth together based on the information that we can get. Who knows how much has been lost along the way? So it's a mistake to assume this because this. You always need to take into account that our information is incomplete. Okay? Taxonomic groups. Taxonomy is the process of naming and differentiating different organisms from each other based on their relationships to each other and their environment. Okay, so we have our life here. Here's a different way of phylogenetic tree, looking at a phylogenetic tree. Okay, where you've got bacteria and archaea at the top, and then you kind of break off into these other groups. Okay, here's bacteria, and then archaea, and then we break off into these groups, which become animals and all of that. And then this group comes down here and becomes plants, and this group down here goes on to become planktons and all of those in the ocean. Okay. So, let's start off by talking about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. A prokaryote is a single-celled organism. Okay? It's still a cell. It is simply one that works autonomously on its own. It doesn't need a network to survive. Whereas eukaryotes are multi-celled organisms. You and I are eukaryotes. We rely on a whole bunch of different cells working together to fulfill functions. When we are giving taxonomic classifications to organisms, we go through a sort of ladder of broad category to narrow category. We start with domain. You and I are in domain eukarya. Why? We're eukaryotes. Multiple cells, okay? More than multiple. Kingdom, Animalia. We are in the animal kingdom. We are in phylum Chordata. That means that we have backbones. We have spines. Class, Mammalia. Mammary glands, fur, warm blood. Order, primates. sharing it with monkeys and such, right? Then there are suborders, superfamilies, family Hominidae, subfamily, genus Homo, species Homo sapiens. Now, as we go down through this, we share that space with fewer and fewer organisms, like in that cladogram, right? We are sharing fewer traits with organisms. Up here in Eukarya, we share that with a tree, right? In kingdom Animalia, we share that with a lizard. Down here in order primates, we share that with a gorilla. Down here in genus Homo, well, right now we're the only Homo genus species, or Homo genus left on Earth, but there used to be a lot more of us, okay? We'll talk more about all of that later on. The genera, so this genus, that's always capitalized, by the way. And then your species is always uncapitalized. And your genus and species together is always italicized. Bear that in mind when you're doing your research projects later on. Any questions? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about these broad categories of organisms before we end for the day. Prokaryotes. Prokaryotes, so single-celled organisms. We separate these into producers and consumers. You can kind of separate people into that too, right? You got those who make and those who take. Producers are often photosynthesizers, okay? So they will absorb the energy from the sun, often gases from the atmosphere, and generate nutrients from that. The consumers are the ones who eat those producers, okay? There is a 3.5 billion-year-old record of these prokaryotes. Those earliest bacterial colonies were prokaryotic. We're actually pushing that date further back all the time. It might actually be closer to 3.6 billion now, if I remember correctly from an article I read not long ago. Okay? These include archaea and bacteria. Bacteria are by far the most common that we have on Earth now. Archaeans were far more common in the past. Interestingly enough, the colonies of organisms that live in your gut, you ever see probiotic written on the things you drink or eat? Like your yogurt, it's probiotic. You know what that means? You eat that and it benefits the culture of cells in your gut. Most of those are archaeans. You have a colony of both bacteria and archaeans in your gut that help you to process your food. When that colony starts to suffer, when it starts to die off, that's when you have all sorts of digestive problems, which is why probiotics are good for you to eat every now and then. Eukaryotes. There are lots of different types of eukaryotes. Protists are a very common form of eukaryotes. So a lot of our modern day planktons, like foraminiferans, which fill our oceans today, fall under this category. They are responsible for making most of the limestones and chalks that we get from the oceans, that were fossil limestones and chalks that we get from the oceans. Green algae, plants, obviously eukaryotes. Plants, where did plants come from? It's an interesting thought. A plant actually came from something called endosymbiosis. So what happened here was a consumer cell devoured a producer cell, and then instead of dissolving it, for some reason, probably due to mutation, it just kind of sat there. And so this producer cell kept producing energy, and because it was in the consumer cell got some of that energy. And this ended up working very efficiently. This ended up being a huge advantage. This combined endosymbiotic relationship meant that this particular cell was very successful and began to make copies of itself with this tendency towards absorbing the producer cell and utilizing it instead of consuming it. And so what happened here is you eventually get to the point where they are made together, their DNA meshed together, and you end up with the first plant cells. Okay? Let's see, they developed tissues. These tissues connected the cells together, which is what gave them that first rigid structure and allowed them to form the long chains of things like seaweed in the oceans and eventually became things like trees and flowers and bushes and plants that are on land. We'll talk about that process a lot more later on, how they moved out of the water. They became vascular from non-vascular. Okay, so if you think of the word vascular in our terms, that means our heart. We have a heart that pumps water, or it pumps blood through our bodies, right? It's our vascular system. Plants have a vascular system as well, but it moves sap and water through their bodies. That was something that came up when plants transferred from the water, from just living in water to moving out on land. Again, this is something we'll talk about more later on, but the development of a vascular system was a huge advantage that gave them that edge that they needed. Angiosperms. Angiosperms are flowering plants, believe it or not. They've only been around on the earth since the Cretaceous time period. As the dinosaurs were working on getting themselves extinct, flowering plants were showing up. Okay? So for most of the time that plants have been around on Earth, there have not been flowers. Okay? Gymnosperms, things like fir trees, like your Christmas tree, those have been around for a lot longer than angiosperms, but they were by no means the first plants. Most of the forests during Earth's time period were one kind of gymnosperm or another. They don't use flowers to fertilize or to make their seeds. They use cones or pods to spread those seeds. Fungi, so things like mushrooms. These are consuming organisms, separate from animals and plants. Interestingly enough, though, fungi are more closely related to you and me than they are to trees. Yeah, just genealogically speaking, fungi, mushrooms are closer related to animals than they are to plants. They spread by spore instead of by seed. Those spores require water or moisture of some kind to survive, which is why you don't tend to see mushrooms in dry places. Okay. Then we've got our animals, and we separate our animals into our vertebrates and our invertebrates, those that have backbones and those that do not. Notice on this phylogenetic tree, where are the mammals? Right at the top, right? Okay, real quick. Our animals, invertebrate animals specifically, we're going to be learning about more of these groups throughout the rest of the class. But we've got sponges. Someone calling me? Oh, no, it's my wife texting me. Sponges live in the ocean. These are suspension feeders, meaning that they have little flagella that just kind of hang out in the water and grab yummy things like planktons and pull them down to eat them. They have specialized cells for grabbing, specialized cells for digesting, and all of that. Cnidarians, these include jellyfish, coral, sea anemones, stuff like that. Okay, they share radial symmetry. They also tend to have those sort of flagella that catch things out of the ocean. That's a common theme in sedentary organisms. Mollusks. So you've got octopi, squid, snails, slugs. Okay, these are all mollusks. Interesting to think that octopi and snails share the same group, but yeah, they are all mollusks. Okay, bryozoans. These kind of look like coral. Many of the structures are similar to coral, but the animals themselves look completely different and have actually been around for a bit longer. So we'll talk more about those. Arthropods, trilobites, insects, right? These are crustaceans like crabs, lobsters. All of these are arthropods. They have exoskeletons, meaning that their skeletal structures, their rigid support structures for their body are on the outside instead of the inside. They often can curl up into sort of segmented shapes as well. Echinoderms. These, along with the cnidarians, cnidarians are kind of a subset of echinoderm, I should say. These have that same radial symmetry. These include sea urchins, very sharp, don't step on, right? And crinoids, which we've talked about a bit in our class and which we will talk about a lot more later on. Crinoids have a fantastic fossil record, very interesting history. They used to just stay attached to one place, kind of like an underwater flower. They would attach there, grow there, stay there their whole lives, just kind of like with these fronds out in the water catching yummy food. But a fascinating change that they've had over time is they've actually developed the ability to detach themselves and use those eating fronds to propel themselves through the water. And so you can see them swimming along the bottom of the ocean nowadays. And then they'll just attach themselves, sit there for a while, and just eat. But if they want to move again, they'll just detach and go somewhere else. Very interesting evolutionary adaptation. Okay, a little bit about animals with backbones. We call these chordates. We are in chordata. Remember that? Now, there were organisms that developed quite a long time ago with what were called a notochord. This particular organism is called a pikaia. We will discuss that more in Module 3. But this notochord was the first actual evidence of a backbone or spine-like structure, a central column for a nervous system to branch from. Okay? And that nervous system can control a lot of the functions that we have today, that chordates have today. Chordates include fishes, amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, all of that. Okay? All of these things have backbones. Now, mammals are in 3 categories: placentals, marsupials, and monotremes. Placentals, that's you and me. Why are we called placentals? We give birth to mostly developed young that are attached to something called a placenta, which you've ever seen is super gross. Okay? And if you ever give birth to a child, you will see one. Or if you're ever in the room when your wife gives birth to a child, you will see one. Wonderful experience. Highly recommend it. I've been there for all 3 of my children being born. Can't beat it. But that placenta provides nutrients and acts as also kind of like a filter for the baby so that it can develop more in the mother's womb. Whereas marsupials, on the other hand, give birth to highly underdeveloped young. And then those young grow up the rest of their time in a pouch. Think of a kangaroo. Kangaroo gives birth to a baby the size of a grain of rice. And then that baby makes its way into the mother's pouch and then grows the rest of the time there. A monotreme, on the other hand, these are mammals that lay eggs. Can anyone think of a monotreme?
Birds.
Birds are not mammals. Huh? Yeah, the platypus. Platypi are monotremes, mammals that lay eggs. How interesting. Believe it or not, there are reptiles that give birth to live young. So there are exceptions to some of these rules, right? Simply based upon mutation. And that mutation given an advantage based upon environmental parameter. At some point, it was more useful for the organisms that are what we call monotremes today to continue laying eggs. Perhaps a relic from reptile ancestry, while the rest of us moved on to give birth to live young, one way or another. And there are some reptiles that have adapted the ability to give birth to live young because it gives them a better advantage than laying eggs. Mutation. Any questions for today? Alrighty, then I'm going to end the recording here and vamos.
Vamos.